Bart Hughes, who's now passed away without recognition. I first met Bart in 1965 in Ibiza, right at the dawn of the psychedelic age. He became my teacher, or guru, if you like. He was a scientist, a medical student, the son and grandson of doctors, when in 1962 he discovered the mechanism behind getting high, and a bit later, the secret of how repression was affected in the brain, something Freud had tried to explain in electrical terms in his project for a scientific psychology, a magnificent effort, but ultimately, as he himself admitted, a failure. I'm afraid because of the limited time available for this talk, I won't be able to fully explain both discoveries. First, the way consciousness is expanded, and secondly, the ego mechanism, whereby the distribution of blood in the brain is affected by the constriction of arteries, repressing function in one part to concentrate attention or blood in parts where it's needed, in particular the speech system. I did originally intend to do this in one talk because they are connected and obviously it makes a lot of sense. And I have printed out that original talk here, so if anybody's interested, they can take a copy at the end and read it. But for now, I'll concentrate on his first discovery, how consciousness is expanded by an increase in the capillary blood volume in the brain. Bart was first given acid in 1958 as a medical student as part of a psychiatric experiment. He had hallucinations. He saw one of the doctors as a devil with horns, another as a chimpanzee, and a third as a pig. 6 others on the experiment saw the devil, and 3 saw the pig. His wife, Barbara, was friends with a lot of people in the bohemian stratum of society, and he gradually moved into their company and began smoking pot, having first established that it wasn't toxic and that he wouldn't become addicted. He was soon an enthusiastic smoker and began advocating it to his medical colleagues. And when he and Barbara had a daughter, they named her Maria Juana. His advocacy of marijuana to the medical colleagues gained him a bad reputation in the medical profession. And a bit later, his flat was raided by the police looking for grass, and this was reported in the newspapers, and that did nothing to improve his image. The top professor of psychiatry at the University of Amsterdam, who'd previously asked him to become his assistant when he qualified, now told him there'd be nowhere for him to practice in the city. Bart's father had always told him that he regretted having practiced medicine because his patients wouldn't do what he recommended, which was to be vegetarian, take cold showers in the morning, do regular exercises, that sort of thing. And he said if he'd had his time over, he'd have been a writer. Bart now decided to give up his career in the profession and become an independent teacher on his own. His discoveries were not recognized in the profession. Indeed, at that time, in the late 50s and early 60s, the very concept of expanded consciousness was unknown. It was not a subject that was studied. It didn't fit into any of the categories in the syllabus. Once free, the first thing he did with another genius friend of his, a mathematician, who'd previously synthesized mescaline, was to make LSD. They did the work in his friend's mother's house, and at one point in the process they used the bathtub. While they were out having a coffee, the friend's mother came in and pulled the plug. They had to reacquire all the lost chemicals, but in the end they succeeded. The acid was perfect. They dosed it out on sugar lumps. It was the first acid made in Europe outside the pharmaceutical companies. Bart was first and foremost a biologist. He'd always collected reptiles and amphibians. In his holidays, he used to hitchhike around Europe, catching snakes, lizards, etc., he turned his bedroom into a terrarium. At one point, he had over 200 in the room, including a crocodile that used to sunbathe on the branch of it that he'd fixed sticking out of the window. He'd caught it as a baby. When it was nearly full grown, the neighbors complained and he was forced to take it to the zoo, where he used to go and visit it regularly. He regarded man as the hairless talking ape, an animal like all others, but with two peculiarities. First, he stood upright, and secondly, he talked. Between them, these two characteristics were responsible not only for his success in evolutionary terms, but also for the perilous predicament that he finds himself in. The invention of language undoubtedly enabled Homo sapiens to achieve unparalleled technological and intellectual progress, both in the physical and the psychological spheres, gaining an understanding of the way things work, both inside and outside the body. But the flip side of the coin was that it also led to the Tower of Babel situation, the misunderstanding, suspicion, and hostility that infect our relations with each other, both on the personal and the international level. What Bart saw was that in adopting the upright position, man was placing his brain at the mercy of gravity, which exerts its force on the volume of blood contained inside the skull. This was a crucial point that no one had ever considered before. There was a eureka moment for Bart. Just as for Newton it was seeing the apple fall from a tree, for Bart it came when he saw Titi, an African yogi drummer, standing on his head at a party. When, after a considerable time, he stood up again, Bart asked him, "Why did you do that?" "Well," said Titi, "if there's no weed to smoke, I stand on my head to get high." Aha, thought Bart. I see, it must put more blood in the brain. Now, in every culture on earth, there's the myth of the fall of mankind. In the Judeo-Christian tradition, the expulsion from the Garden of Eden, which followed acquiring the knowledge of good and evil from eating the forbidden fruit. It's usually explained in moral terms. For example, in Greek mythology, the Golden Age, in which man lived in peace and harmony, was followed by ages denominated in diminishing values of metals, silver, bronze, etc. What Bart showed was that the fall was nothing more nor less than the loss of brain blood to gravity due to the upright position. A loss further compounded by the sealing of the skull at the end of growth. Now, this is where we get into virgin scientific territory. Everyone knows that the circulation of the blood is the most essential fact in life. Within the body, whichever organs are in action attract a greater volume of blood than they have when they're not in use. For example, in digesting a meal, the stomach is engorged with blood. In the act of sex, the sexual organs are, etc. Now, the same thing happens in the brain. Whichever centers are in action attract extra blood. These are the basic facts. The fall of blood due to the upright position means that there's less available than in the four-legged position with the neck horizontal. But there's one more factor that's relevant. When we're born, the skull is in separate plates that can fold over on top of each other in the process of birth so they can emerge through the narrow passage of the cervix. The fontanelles, gaps or holes between the plates, seal early in life, leaving the plates separated by sutures, seams of fibrous fingers which gradually grow together in the course of growth until at the end of that process, between 18 and 22, they completely ossify and the skull becomes a solid case around the brain, which can then no longer pulsate on the heartbeat as all other organs do. This results in a further loss of blood, since this pulsation had produced a pressure which was exerted on the volume of water in the brain. Well, It's not actually called water, it's called cerebrospinal fluid, but it is basically water. This cerebrospinal fluid is produced in the brain, and it's the brain and the spinal column. The central nervous system, as it were, floats in it, and it protects it from the buffets of life. So when the sealing of the skull causes the suppression of the pulse pressure in the arteries, and they consequently shrink, there's nothing to prevent the volume of this water from expanding still further, which it does at the expense of blood. It's this further loss of brain blood at the onset of adulthood that marks the end of youth. It's a bring down. The natural creativity and spontaneity of youth diminish, and that is why we want to get high, to regain the youthful state of mind. Now, Albert Hofmann was a chemist working for Sandoz when, unintentionally, he synthesized the most wonderful and purest psychedelic known to man, LSD. The reason he was working with lysergic acid was because of its strong vasoconstricting properties. He was looking for something to help stop bleeding in childbirth. Strangely enough, after accidentally ingesting some of this wondrous substance, he didn't connect that property with the expanded consciousness which he had. Bart, on the other hand, noticed on acid that the veins on the back of his hands were constricted, and he put two and two together. The circulation of the blood, in case anyone doesn't know this, consists of the arteries carrying the blood to the various organs, from which it flows into the capillaries, tiny hair-like vessels that interface with the cells themselves, from which the exchange of nutrients takes place, glucose and oxygen in the case of the brain, and into which the waste product of metabolism, carbon dioxide, is discharged. The blood is then carried back to the heart in the veins via the lungs, where the CO2 is released in exhaling and the blood is reoxygenated in inhaling. Now, arteries have nerves attached to them, by means of which the central nervous system maintains a constant flow of blood. It can relax or constrict them for this purpose. So when a strong vasoconstrictor is introduced into the system, the immediate result will be a reduction of blood flow, but the central nervous system will do everything it can to counter the effect in the arteries and restore the level to what it was before, but it can do nothing about the veins. The veins have no nerves attached, they're just drains. With a strong constrictor inside them, they're strongly constricted, less blood can flow out, with the inevitable consequence that the capillaries expand, thus allowing millions, if not billions, of brain cells to reach the level of metabolism at which their function becomes conscious, the threshold of consciousness. Now, all cells receive some blood, enough at least to keep them alive, but whether their activity reaches this threshold depends on the volume of blood in the capillaries and the level of metabolism which that permits. The important thing to realize is that the vasoconstriction will be more pronounced in the veins than in the arteries, since the central nervous system will do everything it can to neutralize the effect in the arteries, but it can do nothing about the veins. Bart did some research which showed him that all drugs that get you high are vasoconstrictors to one degree or another. Of course, many of them are toxic and have specific chemical effects, which may be stimulant, narcotic, or whatever, but the underlying cause of the high is the increased capillary volume in the brain. What is consciousness? Well, whatever else you can say about it, one thing that's incontrovertible is that it's a product of brain metabolism. It's energy, light, the awareness of what's going on inside and outside the body. The brain metabolism is the oxidation of glucose. Glucose is produced by photosynthesis, the action of sunlight on plants. when the plants are consumed by man, the sunlight encapsulated in them is oxidized and released in the brain as consciousness. So you could say that it's the sun shining in the brain. The more glucose that's oxidized, the brighter the light. What's important is the level of metabolism of a brain cell or a cluster of brain cells. That's what determines whether the activity taking place becomes conscious or not. A lot of action takes place without us becoming aware of it. In that case, the neurotransmitters are still doing their job, messages are being passed from cell to cell, etc., but we are not aware of it. Whether we are aware of what's taking place in the brain cells depends on the strength of the fire burning inside them. The burning question, as it were, is how bright is the light generated? Does it reach the level at which we notice it? Just as there's a range of frequencies that we can hear and a spectrum of light waves that we can see, so there's a level of brain metabolism that determines whether we are conscious of the activity taking place or not. Below a certain level, we are not conscious of it. With a greatly increased volume of blood in the brain capillaries, the amount of glucose consumed by the brain increases exponentially. In normal adult life, the brain, which constitutes 2% of total body weight, consumes 20% of the daily carbohydrate intake. Now, since glucose is the sole source of energy for the brain, it actually accounts for 50% of the daily glucose intake. On LSD, the number of brain cells reaching the conscious level of metabolism is vastly expanded, and consequently, the glucose consumption is hugely increased too. And this results in the hyperglycemic symptoms so well known to occur: cold hands, chills, trembling, perceptual distortions, paranoia, hallucinations, not to mention the weakening of the meaning of the word, the loss of the critical faculty. This can result in the huge inflation of significance to a few particular words. I've seen people in the extreme throes of sugar-lack repeating phrases such as, today is tomorrow, is yesterday, is today, is tomorrow, and so on, over and over again as they cling to the last vestiges of their egos. As the sugar level continues to fall, even that will go. Eventually there'll be no one at home in the head. Knock, knock, no answer. This is what we used to call flip out, as opposed to freak out, which is the temporary occurrence of some frightening episode. With knowledge of the facts about sugar-lack, it's easy to take measures to escape a freak out. It's a matter of taking sugar to restore sanity. Without the knowledge, things can go from bad to worse. The sugar level is controlled by two hormones, adrenaline and insulin. When it's too low, adrenaline is secreted and it injects more glucose into the blood from the liver. And when it's too high, insulin extracts the surplus from the blood and stores it in the liver. Incidentally, adrenaline is also a vasoconstrictor. So in emergency, we have a shot of the two things we need most for optimal function: more glucose and blood in the brain. For the synthesis of adrenaline, ascorbic acid, vitamin C, is essential. And the body can't store ascorbic acid as it does other vitamins, so with the repeated use of adrenaline, which comes with an acid sugar-lack, the body's supply can run out quite soon. So it's advisable to take a time-release vitamin C pill with the trip, or have fruit or some other source available. Because the use of adrenaline is usually triggered by fight, fright, or flight situations, its use on acid because of sugar-lack will often give rise to associations of that nature, leading to a chain of frightening feelings or images known as the horrors. Another thing to remember, ironically, is that on a low sugar level, the last thing you want is sugar. Nonetheless, it's what you need to extricate yourself from the situation. Freud gave the image of the ego as the rider and the id as the horse. When the rider is lost, the horse will take you anywhere it wants. If it feels that it wants to fly, there's nobody there to say that's impossible. With the distorted perspective of a sugarlac, to zip from one side of the Grand Canyon to the other can appear like a doddle. Just spread your wings and you'll probably catch a thermal. The problem with any measures one can take to counter the effect of gravity in the upright position is that they're only temporary. What goes up must come down. The increased capillary blood volume will only last as long as the drug's vasoconstriction lasts. In the case of acid, probably 3 or 4 hours. After that, the original status quo will be restored as you gradually come down. When thinking about the situation, Bart realized there was one measure he could take that would be permanent, and that was to reverse the effect of the sealing of the skull by trepanation. Making a hole in the skull would enable the brain as an organ to pulsate again on the heartbeat. He knew that, anatomically speaking, the skull has a separate origin from the other bones in the skeleton, and holes in it don't seal. Making a hole would allow the membranes around the brain to expand on the heartbeat and restore the pulse pressure lost when it sealed. He went to the leading brain physiologist in Amsterdam to explain what he'd concluded, hoping to persuade him to arrange for him to be trepanned. The professor was skeptical, and he said anyhow he had measured the pulsation inside the adult skull. Yes, said Bart, by sticking a hollow needle through the skull. But the professor wasn't for budging, so he decided he'd have to do it himself. The high from a hole in the head is no more than a gentle lift. If, say, acid is 100 and a good hash 60, then the hole would be, say, 30. What it does, however, that's extremely valuable is relieve the ego from the need for chronic repression. The speech system can float again as in childhood. In 1970, after a few Bosch shots, which are described in my book Borehole, I trepanned myself. Originally, I used a hand trepan, which was a bit like a corkscrew, but with a ring of teeth at the bottom of the shaft. It was an awkward procedure, a bit like trying to uncork a bottle from inside it. And it was unsuccessful. Subsequently, I used an electric drill, and that was much easier. It was comparatively simple. I was alone in the flat, and after it had finished, I busied myself clearing up the mess, and I waited to see what would happen. Over the next 3 or 4 hours, the feeling I had was one of increasing lightness, literally as if a weight was being lifted from my mind. I began to notice it probably an hour after the operation ended, and then it grew stronger. I hadn't really known what to expect, and it was rather exhilarating, this gradual lightening. Would it last? Well, it lasted till I went to sleep, and when I woke in the morning, it was still there. I hadn't come down. And in the days that followed, I realized that it was a permanent change in my consciousness that had taken place. I was in a better place, ready for anything. I always found that the worst part of coming down from a trip was the last part, when the old heaviness of the old adult routine set in again. Well, after trepanation, that's the part you don't have. You stay just above it. And I must say, it's well worth it. And I'm eternally grateful to Bart for having shown me the way.